Live. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're here to start picking up classes again. Let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing, where we left off. It's been like 9, 10 months since we all disappeared, and we're going to be starting it all up again. So, a couple of house cleaning things. Let's throw this up. Okay, so the current schedule is this. We now have 3 professors who are going to be teaching classes soon. Dr. Tartaglia will be joining us for epistemology at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today. He's put together a course on Gödel's incompleteness theorems, and it's a pretty awesome course. He's been trying to teach it to me for like 8 years now. It's really complicated stuff, but he can sort of lead people through it step by step with the mathematics, the derivation, what it means, what it doesn't mean. You get to learn an awful lot of stuff about computer science and AI and what sort of models and systems and formal systems the theorem applies to and all of that stuff. So he's putting that together. There's another course on Quine, which he's been putting together for mostly his whole life. It's his life's work. And that will be an alternative 3rd-year backbone course. So actually, why don't I try to pull up something else to show you here? What we have is, I guess this one will work. Okay, so in the core curriculum, we have year 1, year 2, year 3. My year 3 course has this backbone of decoding Zarathustra, which we're going to be starting again on Fridays. So we're going to be doing a recorded version of that course that we did twice in Twitter Spaces of reading through Zarathustra and decoding it. We can talk more about that later. But an alternative, if you don't care about Nietzsche so much, an alternative 3rd-year backbone course will be Dr. Tartaglia's Quine course. And you can think of Quine as the Aristotelian contribution to the philosophical conversation right before the postmodernists came in and just sort of destroyed everything. There are complementary courses that go along with it on Wittgenstein, Putnam, Frege, and Gödel, Peirce and Popper. And then we're going to look for another professor to do postmodernism instead, which we don't have right now. But Dr. Tartaglia is going to be doing the Gödel course soon, and he's got the Quine course coming out after that. And then he and I are both going to be co-teaching a course on constitutional interpretation methods. And so we're going to talk about natural law theory. We're going to talk about the founding fathers. We're going to do landmark cases in the Supreme Court and talk about what American liberty is and the history of American liberty. And we're going to talk about different ways of interpreting the Constitution, different legal theories for how to do that. I have some documents here, some really cool graphics I could put up, I suppose, to show you what we've been working on with that course. Open up that. And none of those are right. How about I say recent? I've had them opened up recently. Okay, yeah. So there's that. This is the really good one. None of them are opening for some reason. So we'll be talking about landmark cases, modes of he and I are going to co-teach this one together. And we'll look at some contemporary issues. Why doesn't this one open? The internet is going out. Can you still hear me? Are we frozen?
Yeah, your
All right, you
audio
can
and
still.
video is good.
Interesting. For some reason, Google Drive is not opening this document for me. That's really a bummer. Okay, well, we don't have to go into that right now, but we've got some really cool graphics we've been putting together on ways to interpret the Constitution. These are legal theories that the Supreme Court justices argue about and that different legal scholars argue about as appropriate ways to, here, I'll share it over here. So you can look at historical practices, structuralism, original intent, original meaning, originalism, general contextualism. These are all different ways of interpreting the Constitution. And we look at Scalia and his theories, and it's a really fun course. So in the meantime, those 3 classes are coming out soon. And right now, what we're going to start doing is Mondays and Fridays, we're going to be picking up some of the classes we were doing before and adding a few new ones. So we've got philosophy of religion, where we're going to pick up exactly where we left off before. So I'll get into that soon. And then later tonight, we're going to do epistemology. That's a new one we're starting. We're going to be starting ethics tomorrow. We're going to continue the wrestling with Jordan Peterson in the context of the Children of Nietzsche course that we were doing before. We're going to be starting metaphysics as a brand new course on Wednesday. And then this course that I've written all up, it's really one of the ones I'm most excited about, is the second year backbone course. It's basically a pre-Socratic, ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary philosophy course. Those 5 courses all rolled into one. It's a really fun way of looking with narrative at like the conversation as it repeats. It has like 15 unique interpretive lenses from a metaphysical perspective or metaphilosophical perspective for understanding the conversation in philosophy, and that's going to be exciting. We'll be continuing our dialoguing with Plato class on Thursday. We're going to be continuing the year 1 backbone material that we were doing when we did determinism and free will and the mind-body problem and all of that stuff. I think we left off in the a priori section. So we'll be continuing that on Thursday. Then we're going to start for the 3rd time the Decoding Zarathustra class, and we'll be doing that Fridays, and that'll actually be recorded for the first time. And we'll be continuing philosophy of mind where we left off. So we have another professor who is literature. She's a writer, and she's going to come in and do some courses in literature and storytelling, which are going to be pretty fun. So that's probably enough of that. Let's shut that off. Just back again. So let's remind ourselves of where we left off. In the philosophy of religion course, we started out talking about, so the first section of this course is philosophy and religious beliefs. So the topics that we've been debating in the excerpts, this is a year 1 course, so it's done in the year 1 style where we read little excerpts from different writers on the topics, and we just sort of get a general feel for the battlefield, for the battleground of things that are still live debates in philosophy. So in part 1 of the philosophy of religion course, we're just looking at people who are arguing, is it moral to believe things without evidence? Maybe faith is an anti-virtuous thing to begin with. Or St. Thomas Aquinas saying we could not use revelation in scripture at all, and we could just come philosophically to the truth that there is a God, and that many of the theological orthodox doctrines of the Catholic Church are correct. And so we've sort of been having this debate. Let's see where we left off on this. So some of the questions we were considering when we left off was, what is the nature of the relationship between faith and reason? Is faith an affront to reason? Does reason support faith? If a doctrine is unreasonable, is it good religion that require belief in it anyway? We've had Plantinga bring up the idea that, well, you don't know a lot, and so something might seem unreasonable and that not be unreasonable if you only knew a little bit more. We'll talk more about that today because we're going to try to get through more of his essay today. Is faith positively immoral, no matter in what it is placed, right? So we read a really powerful ethical essay saying, if you're allowing yourself to believe things because it comforts you, you're the sort of person I can't trust. You might believe that the ship doesn't need to have any maintenance done on it because it's nice to believe that, and it would mean less work for you, and then we all drown. So maybe you shouldn't practice the art of believing things without good reasons. And so it's like a direct attack from an ethical perspective on not being faithful in the first place. We've also looked at fideists who say, look, the whole point of belief in God is that it is unreasonable. There would be no room for faith if I could just argue it and know it deductively and look for evidence and be convinced of it. Then there's no room for faith, but faith is a virtue. So everything in philosophy is debatable. And the very question of is faith good or not is sort of what we're debating here. If there is a God, is he the God of reason? Will all correct philosophy inevitably support true religion for that reason? If so, can we use reason to develop our religious beliefs? That doesn't mean there's no such thing as revelation, but it should at least, whatever we think is revealed to us should not outrage reason, some people might say, some philosophers might say. And then, of course, there's the God of the philosophers, which is basically, we're not even looking at the Bible. We're just coming to understand that there must be a creator God and what we could know about him. Okay. Is faith prior to reason? Does reason need to be grounded in something? And is that the proper and not unreasonable domain of all faith? That's sort of the essay we're reading now by Plantinga. Can there be faith beyond serving that role? So we looked at Thomas Aquinas, and these videos are online, and you can go catch up if you want to now that we're starting again. It is proper that God would give us revelation of truth, he says. We need that for salvation and for life. But it's also proper, he says, that some of the truths that he reveals to us could be gotten to just through reason alone as well. So why don't we do philosophy and see what we can know apart from revelation and see that it does not contradict revelation? So his Summa Theologica, which we spend a lot of time in year 2 reading through the entire thing. It's really fantastic work of philosophy. We're also going to read Ghazali and Ibn Rushd and the incoherencies and all of that stuff too in year 2. But one of the things we do in year 2, along with reading Plato and the dialogues and Descartes' meditations, is we go through the Summa Theologica. It's really worth reading. But here we just, in year 1, we just have this little excerpt of some arguments from St. Thomas Aquinas, and these were the positions he was arguing for and making a case of, and there's videos on that. Then we read Clifford. I beg to differ. He said, if you wish to follow reason, you will find that faith by definition is immoral. Okay, there's a normative case here. He's not saying, well, you haven't yet justified to me that there is a God, so I refuse to believe. He's saying, I choose not to believe things without good reasons because that would be a bad thing to do. Okay, faith is a willingness to believe without good evidence. There's nothing righteous about such an action or attitude, and it corrupts the souls of those who engage in it and makes them less ethical and less trustworthy members of society. He really gave a very powerful, strong argument against faith as the idea that it's a very bad thing. Faith cannot coexist with reason. It is unreasonable from the start by definition. And of course, the fideists would agree with that. Their entire point is the whole point of faith is that I don't have reasons for it. The entire point is to believe without good reason. And then we read Anthony Flew. And Anthony Flew, some people in the after conversation, if I remember, this was 10 months ago, were saying, I don't think he's very genuine. I think he's lying. He doesn't really believe this. But it turns out he came to believe in faith and to believe in God near the end of his life, if I remember correctly. But in a sense, Anthony Flew is just trying to set the stage. And his argument was, okay, where's the burden of proof here? There could be a God. There might not be a God. We're going to read Aquinas, but we're also going to read Anselm, and we're going to find out that maybe that entire conversation is foolish to begin with. But Anthony Flew comes in and says, look, what we need is evidence. And so it's not bad to believe in something religious, but you need some evidence. So belief in religious doctrines requires evidence or the support of good reasons for us to philosophically adopt it. St. Thomas Aquinas was right. He says that that's what religions ought to do if they expect us to believe, but maybe they can do it. And if they do, then we should be convinced, he says. It's the burden of the religious that they should present to us an idea of God which is itself reasonable, and then evidence that is actually, in fact, a God which does exist. This is something that they could do, right? So he says, in theory, that's doable. You could do that. And so let's have the theologians come forward. Let's have the philosophers who believe in God come forward, the theistic philosophers, and tell us why we should join them. Until they do, it's our duty, he says, to remain unbelieving. We shouldn't be, so he's sort of agreeing with the last author a little bit and saying, you shouldn't be believing things without good reason. But that doesn't mean that everything to do with God has to be faith-based. It could be based in reason. So we see how many different positions there are, pro-God and anti-God, that are also pro-reason and anti-reason. We've got 4 categories at least right now. You can be, I want reasons and I want to believe in God. You can be, I want reasons and I don't believe in God. You can be, I don't want reasons, and that's why I won't believe in God. And you can be, I don't want reasons, that's why I do believe in God, right? The whole point of faith is that it's not based in reason, some fideists say. So we've got a lot of different positions pro and against God, but also pro and against this relationship and conversation between philosophy, using the rules of right reason and thinking, and coming to truth and coming to epistemological justification for assenting to propositions or living in a certain way. Now, all of this is very noisy and very interesting and very philosophical in the background, but now we get to Plantinga, and Plantinga is a gentleman that we will be spending a lot of year 3 looking into. We're going to look into him and Bonjour in year 3. He's a heck of an interesting voice. And we've actually done 2, 3, maybe 4 videos on this one essay by Plantinga so far, and we're going to try to get through at least half of what's left today on it. Plantinga comes into that context. He says, stop. Just everybody stop. We're not debating whether or not there's a rock in my front yard. We're not debating whether or not there's a meteor orbiting Mars. That's not the kind of conversation we're having here. We might be, and I'm going to make the case that we are, debating something which is properly basic. For it to be basic means that you're not supposed to argue to it. You need to believe it in order to make arguments for other things. Now, that might not sound convincing at first, but there's a lot of properly basic ideas, according to Plantinga, and we're going to be starting our epistemology course in a couple of hours, and we're going to look at what basic means and what foundationalism is and what reliabilism is and different systems for how does this truth get justified by this truth. Does it go back for infinity where everything has to be justified by something else, or are there properly basic foundations upon which I can build other things? And so we're in the middle of this essay by Plantinga where we're going to talk about his argument that belief in God is properly basic. And he's taking a long time to really lay the groundwork to do it. And so we've been reading this essay for a while now, and we should pick up where we left off here. So let me find where we left off. I had it here a moment ago. I thought I did. I think we're in part 3C. I folded the page, and yet it's not folded anymore. Here we go. Part 2C. Okay, Plantinga, here we go. So we've put a lot of effort into this. The last 3 videos are us reading through this essay. So you can go watch those. We won't rehearse all of it again, but he says that he got to this through his thoughts about foundationalism and his thoughts about evidentialism and his thoughts on Thomas Aquinas, and he came to some conclusion that he's going to try to lead us to. So let's pick up reading there. I believe this is where we left off, conditions on proper basicality. So what would make an idea properly basic? What sort of an idea? Yellowness, the experience of yellowness. You can't argue to it. You just sort of have it as your starting point when you go thinking about the world. Even if you're in a dream, yellowness as an experience is a basic element of your cognitive processes. He's saying belief in God, as opposed to belief that God exists, but orientation in the universe as if you're in relationship with the divine, something like that, is properly basic. You do believe it, whether you think you do or not, possibly, or it's necessary to do anything else. So let's see where he's going here. Now he's being very careful, and one of the real virtuous things that we've seen in this essay. Oh, Elena, you told me not to forget, and so we won't forget. So before we get back into Plantinga where we left off, it's so good to see you all again. It's been about 10 months. Get your cup, your mug, your glass, your tankard, your chalice, your thermos, your stein, your canteen jug or flask, your vessel of any kind, and fill it with your favorite liquid. I love coffee, and I also love coconut water. And join me now for the unparalleled pleasure, the dopamine hit of the day, the thing that makes literally everything better. It's called the simultaneous sip, and it happens now. Go. Oh, it's good stuff. God damn, that's good. You feel the chills? I feel it. That is some miss that in my day. So we're gonna have some simultaneous sips together. All right. Let's get back into feel it, right? Electricity. All right. So here we go, my friends. Conditions on what would be properly basic. He says, well, one of the virtues of Plantinga here that's so amazing is how much he's arguing against himself. You can tell while we're reading, he has 6 voices in his head, all telling him, here's an idea, but here's why it would be wrong, but here's a response to that, but and he's just giving us all those voices as he works very carefully through to present the idea that he thinks he's come to as the correct one. So what would make an idea properly basic? That's what we're going to pick up. Next, we note a further and fundamental feature of classic varieties of foundationalism. They all lay down certain conditions of proper basicality. Okay, we're going to do epistemology soon. If you're a foundationalist, you think all the truths build on things that are just grounded, foundationally true, and those people who believe those systems have conditions for what would make something properly basic. From the foundationalist point of view, not just any kind of belief can be found in the foundations of a rational noetic structure. A belief to be properly basic, that is basic in a rational noetic structure. A belief to be properly basic, that is basic in a rational noetic structure, must meet certain conditions. It must be capable of functioning foundationally, capable of bearing its share of the weight of the whole noetic structure. Thus, Thomas Aquinas, as we have seen, holds that a proposition is properly basic for a person only if it is self-evident to him or evident to the senses. Suppose we take a brief look at self-evidence. Under what conditions does a proposition have it? What kinds of propositions are self-evident? Okay, and remember, when we do these classes, if you're one of the individuals who's in the video, just unmute and interrupt whenever it seems appropriate to do so if you have something to say. We don't raise hands here. We're just here to talk, right? Okay, so what would make something self-evident? Under what conditions does a proposition have it? What kinds of propositions are self-evident? Examples would include very simple arithmetic truths like 2 and 1 make 3. Simple truths of logic, such as no man is both married and unmarried. Perhaps the generalizations of simple truths of logic, such as for any proposition P, the conjunction of P with its denial is false, right? You can't say P and not P in the same sense at the same time or whatever. Okay, that might be properly basic in that the general version of the same thing. And certain propositions expressing identity and diversity. For example, redness is distinct from greenness. Okay, that might just be a properly basic thing. Do we have to argue to it? Do we have to say matter exists? Because matter exists, perceiving matter, like, no, it's just redness and greenness are different. Right? I'm not going to get there from other truths. You just sort of have to start with that in order to be a person and be a thinker. He's saying, okay. What else does he say? The property of being prime is distinct from the property of being composite. Okay, so he's got some real general statements here. He started out with 2 and 1 make 3. No man is both married and unmarried. And now he's gotten pretty general. Well, nothing is both P and not P. Any two things that are different are not the same. The proposition all men are mortal is distinct from the proposition all mortals are men. Okay, that's just a fine the distinction of two totally different statements. There are others that Aquinas gives. I'm sorry, you're about to talk, Roger?
Yeah, sure. So these examples that he is giving, they are a commentary on the patterns that this universe seems rational. That perhaps if this universe has a noetic property, which is another way of saying
It's a question,
God.
but yeah.
There is a God, or the universe is God, or God is the universe, whatever. It behaves like a classical mind where there is all this Boolean logic going on. There is no room for paradox.
Okay, right. It's open question. That's right.
Everything can be parsable by formal logic, which is a big assumption.
Yes, absolutely. This is debatable. Absolutely. So I would say one thing he's saying is this. Is it possible to be a thinking person and deny the rule of non-contradiction? So it might be true that the world is bizarre and strange and not rationally comprehensible. That could be true. But is it still properly basic for you to believe rationally with rational, good logical structures in your brain because anything else is absurd and self-contradictory and argues against you? That would still make it properly basic for a thinking person, even if it wasn't true of the world.
Yeah, well, who is to say that the ideas that pop up in our minds come only from the sensory inputs plus the rationality that goes on, and they do not come from quote unquote intuition, which might be the same thing as all brains in the universe, are, even if dimly, connected to each other, and also connected to perhaps a higher mind or brain or whatever that we might label God. Who is to say that that is not part of a potential epistemology? So maybe
We're going
the
to see that. Yep.
maybe the hardcore empiricists and rationalists, maybe they go too far and they throw away some of the baby with the bathwater. We need to always have the door open for other sources of knowledge and truth, even though we don't surrender to them easily. But we should consider them as a possibility, thanks
Good.
to what has been going on in philosophy, not just in Greece but in India, China, etc.
Yeah. Okay, good. Great questions. Now, we got to remember that we're not yet dealing with Plantinga's ideas. He's outlining the ideas of the properly basic foundationalists and what they say. So we haven't quite yet gotten to what he thinks. We will see the role of instinct by the time this essay is done, I believe. Hey, Mark, you missed the simultaneous sip, but cheers. It's good to have you here, and it's good to be back into this. Okay, so very good. Let's see. He says that Aquinas gives us other examples. The whole is greater than the part. As Roger's pointing out, do we have to think things like this? Is it possible that the world is totally bizarre and weird and doesn't make rational sense? Yeah, it is. But I think for the foundationalists, the point is you're a thinking thing, and you can't actually say in words that you don't think things like that. Like it's there's a problem with saying I believe that something that is greater is lesser. I believe that something is P and not P. Now you can say it poetically, you can say it mythopoetically, right? There's all sorts of ways to point at things that aren't reasonable, but the philosopher's stuck playing the game of what we've got to do is be reasonable. And so if the philosopher is stuck in that world, and if that world can get you anywhere, he has to follow, most philosophers argue, not all of them, everything's arguable in philosophy, but he has to follow rules like these. All right, so where presumably he means by part, the proper part, and more dubiously, the statement man is an animal. Aquinas thought that was properly basic, and he says, I'm not so sure about that, but okay. Still, other candidates which may be less than entirely uncontroversial, may or come from many other areas. For example, if P is necessarily true and P entails Q, then Q is necessarily true. All right, it's a rule of logic. Is that statement itself something that you have to believe in order to move forward in life? Maybe all of the rules of logic are properly basic. If E to the first power occurs before E to the second power, and E to the second power occurs before E to the third power, then E to the first power occurs before E to the third power. Okay, I mean, we understand the logic, we understand the mathematics, and so it turns out that foundationalists, once they've got a couple of qualifications for properly basic statements, can make an awful lot of properly basic statements and say you don't have to argue that 1 and 1 make 2. We just start out with that. We got that. That's just there, and then we build that. We build other truths off of that foundation. You don't have to start with if something has to be true, if something else is true, and that other thing is true, then the first thing also has to be true. Like that's just how brains work. You have to start there. They're saying, now he's not saying yet, but he's examining foundationalism to get to his view, just like he was examining the other things that he examined to get to his view. Okay, how about this one? It is wrong to cause unnecessary and unwanted pain just for the fun of it. Ooh, there's a properly basic ethical principle according to Aquinas, or no, according to other candidates that he's found in the literature, that you don't argue in ethics that it's wrong to torture little babies for fun. You start out knowing it's wrong to torture little babies for fun, and anybody who doesn't know that is broken and can't be in the ethical conversation. So foundationalists sometimes think there's like one or two foundational truths, and sometimes they think there's a billion potential properly basic ideas. And all we have right now from Plantinga is just surveying the field and saying it turns out there's been arguments that all sorts of things like these have been called properly basic. What is it that characterizes these propositions? He then asks. According to the tradition, the outstanding characteristic of a self-evident proposition is that one simply sees it to be true upon grasping or understanding it. So, okay, that's a nice observation from Plantinga. If you observe and understand a proposition and you see immediately that it must be true, no unmarried men are married. Okay, if you know what the words mean, you kind of can't think it's not true. Your brain is just like, well, obviously. Nothing can be both P and not P at the same time in the same way. Is that so obvious? I don't know. It's far out language, but maybe if we properly understood it, it would seem as obvious to us as no unmarried men are married. Okay.
However,
Hmm.
it depends on the ontology that you're looking at when you're looking at the universe. If you conceive of the universe as a straight line tunnel-like chronology, if you pick up an element, it cannot share at the same time two contradictory properties, just as you mentioned.
Yeah.
However, if the universe is structured differently with branching chronologies, you can have the same element occupying different branches, and the guy married in one branch but didn't marry in the other. And if you look at the entire nowness of this universe with the different branching chronologies as if you were a god, you would say that this fellow is both married and unmarried at the same time.
Fantastic. So foundationalists aren't going to be looking at the world that way. And as you've been pointing out, and I think we should underline what you're saying here, it comes from the fact that foundationalists think the world is rationally comprehensible, or at least they tend to, right? And you're saying, well, maybe for God, maybe the world's way too complicated for our silly little primate brains to wrap their heads around it. But yeah, if it were, then there's all sorts of things that seem obviously true to us, which might not be true. I think that's completely legitimate. Um, However, often the P or not P is added with the qualifiers in the same way at the same time. So if they go off two different time branches, maybe that statement would still have to be true. I don't know. Okay, so yeah, absolutely. All right. So we're going to get to his whole point of this essay, and we're going really slowly through it because we love Plantinga, and we're going to spend a lot of time in year 3 looking at what he thinks. Hopefully, hopefully we get through this in 1 or 2 more videos because usually we only do 1 video per essay. But the whole point of this essay is to argue that belief in God, not belief that God, but belief in God, is properly basic. You just wake up knowing it, and then you move on with your day and you do other things, and you don't need to provide evidence for or against it. It's not that kind of belief. And to do that, he's examining these other views to try to understand, well, what would make something properly basic? So let's see where we go. Understanding, so the first thing he says is they all look self-evident. Understanding a self-evident proposition is sufficient for apprehending its truth. Of course, this notion must be relativized to persons. What is self-evident to you might not be self-evident to Roger, who thinks I can question all sorts of things that you guys aren't questioning, which is fantastic. All right. Very simple. Arithmetic truths will be self-evident to nearly all of us, but a truth like 17 and 18 make 35 might be self-evident only to some. And of course, a proposition, so a foundationalist might say, well, anybody who examines 17 and 18 making 35 long enough to fully apprehend it will see that it is self-evidently true. It's just some people are ready for that and some people aren't. So there's all sorts of arguments people make. All right. And of course, a proposition is self-evident to a person only if he does in fact grasp it. So a proposition will not be self-evident to those who do not apprehend the concepts it involves. This is all reminding me of Ensemble, and I know we did a little Ensemble before in the backbone course on the existence of God, and that's really fun. But that's why he says only the fool would say there is no God, because Ensemble says, well, it's self-evident if you just look at what the word God means. Right? The word God is the greatest thing possible to imagine. Can you imagine it existing? Can you imagine it not existing? Which one's greater? Okay, we were talking about the greater one. We were talking, don't change the subject to a less great thing. That's not what we were talking about. And so what do you mean? You think he doesn't exist? By definition, he exists. He's the greatest thing you can imagine. That sounds like nonsense, but it's not as much nonsense
This is also something really, really important to stress, that I think philosophers, when having lay listeners, I don't think they stress this enough, which is the difference between signifiers and signifieds. If we are using the word God, this might mean very different things in different people. In people like theologians that are thinking straight about God for decades, lay people that they just think about God on Sundays, or then you have atheistic lay people who have discarded any idea related to the word God, whatever it might mean. But I think it's way more worthwhile for people to be reminded to not get so hung up with language, because language only goes so far when we're talking about literally the unfathomable.
Okay.
And the God, I think, is
Fantastic.
literally unfathomable.
Right. Okay. And so we've been looking at some essays. We're going to look at some more that ask the question, is God talk meaningful at all? And you're going to like that essay because I think you have what Zarathustra described as the proper level of piety to disregard a lot of things people say about God, right? So wait a minute. I'm a limited, uh, finite creature using words, and I'm talking about, as you just said, the infinite. By definition, anything I say is wrong, right? And so we're going to actually look at some essays that say, from a meta philosophy of religion perspective, stop talking about God. Whatever you're saying is wrong. And we're going to find that the greatest philosophers, a lot in year 3 and in the Consummate Thinkers course that we do in the backbone of year 2, they say, okay, look, I want to talk about something. I want to do philosophy. I want to have syllogisms. I want to have arguments. I want to have propositions. I want to have a nitty gritty back and forth. But I want to talk about something way beyond all that. So I'm going to use literature, and I'm going to use poetry, and I'm going to use mythopoetry, and I'm going to point at things poetically that are beyond what we can actually wrap our heads around. And Socrates did that, and Descartes did it. And we're going to look at the 6 consummate thinkers who do that, and they use literature. Nietzsche did it with Zarathustra, because there are characterological truths that they want to get at. But that's not planned to get at this point. So let's continue to follow his thought process. Of course, a proposition is self-evident to a person only if he can grasp it, so proposition will not be self-evident to those who do not apprehend the concepts it involves. As Aquinas says, some propositions are self-evident only to the learned. His example is the truth that immaterial substances do not occupy space. That might not be obvious to the unlearned, but those of us who understand what the words mean understand it's self-evident that a non-material thing cannot occupy space. That's true, and it's also really fantastic. And we spend a lot of year 2 reading Aquinas. He's awesome. But among those propositions whose concepts not everyone grasps, are some are such that anyone who did grasp them would see their truth. For example, Proposition 17. A model of a first order theory T assigns truth to the axioms of T. What? What are you talking about? Well, if I knew what all those words meant, maybe I would see how obvious that is. Others, 17 and 13 make 30, for example, may be such that some, but not all of those who apprehend them are also set to see that they are obviously true. But how shall we understand this seeing they are true? Those who speak of self-evidence explicitly turn to this visual metaphor and expressly explain self-evidence by reference to vision. You just see it. There are 2 important aspects to the metaphor and 2 corresponding components to the idea of self-evidence. First, there is the epistemic component. A proposition P is self-evident to a person S only if S has immediate knowledge of P. That is, knows P, and does not know P on the basis of his knowledge of other propositions. Consider a simple arithmetic truth, such as his knowledge, such as the sum of 2 and 1 are 3, and compare it with one like 24 squared is 576. I know each of these propositions, and I know the second, but not the first, on the basis of computation, which is a kind of inference. So I have immediate knowledge of the first, but not the second. But there's also a phenomenological component. Now, there's all sorts of philosophers who will make different arguments. Some will say every mathematical truth is self-evident. You just have to understand it well enough by studying it. Some will say there's no such thing as a self-evident truth. Two and two need to be argued for, and they need to be based in something else. And maybe that goes back infinitely or something. There's going to be all sorts of different positions on this, but let's just see what Plantinga says about what other people are saying about this idea. I know each of these propositions. I know the second, but not the first. So, okay. But there's also a phenomenological component. Consider again our two propositions. The first, but not the second, has about it a kind of luminous aura or glow. When you bring it to mind or consider it, Locke speaks in this connection of an evident luster. A self-evident proposition, he says, displays a kind of clarity and brightness to the attentive mind. It just shines like, ooh, yeah, 2 and 2 make 4. Ooh, I can see it. Descartes speaks instead of clarity and distinctness. Each, I think, is referring to the same phenomenological feature. All right, Plantinga, hold on. Clear and distinct perception for Descartes. I don't know if that's a fair way of describing Descartes, to be honest.
Kind of weird, because for one, he was questioning everything, and for the other, he really was a rationalist, right?
Okay.
He wasn't an empiricist or.
Wait. He actually says everything you know comes to you through the senses, through experience, same as Socrates. It's really hard to pin Descartes down. You're not wrong in what you say. So first of all, he has a skeptical method, just like Socrates. But he also is coming to truth that he's certain of, as you point out. So he ain't no skeptic sitting in a skeptic pit. Also, the two ways of trying to understand what Descartes was up to, he gives birth to the rationalist and the empiricist project. Okay. Who is Descartes? Who is Descartes? No, this is really good thing for you to pick up on. This is really worth. Let's have a little detour on Descartes for a moment. We're going to spend a lot of time in year 2 going through his meditations. Who the fuck is Descartes? I think Descartes is a consummate thinker. I think he's a everything rolled in one kind of a guy. He's a crucifixion on the two extremes, pulling them together briefly.
Yeah. I went through his discourse on method, but not yet the meditations.
Oh, we're going to have fun doing that. It'll take your brain apart entirely and put it back together. It's like a death and rebirth. It's a phoenix experience. And he did it on purpose. He wrote it as a mystical text. I know that you're interested in Rumi and mystical texts. Descartes' meditations are designed to induce within you a direct experience with the divine. You're actually supposed to be like, whoa, I'm seeing God. Like I'm having the experience just by going through the philosophical meditation. So anyway, we're going to have a lot of fun with that. But okay, so a brief detour on Descartes. Socrates, at least according to Plato's Socrates, and Descartes both use statements like everything you know comes through experience. And Descartes' entire academic career, except for that one tiny book called The Meditations, was all in science and not philosophy. That was his only philosophy. He did it just to sort of justify the scientific project and then go about examining things and perceiving through the senses and all this stuff, doing optics and geology and other things like that. So wait a minute, hold on. How do we nail Descartes down? Because he gives birth to the rationalist project. He gives birth to the empiricist project. Everybody thinks of him as a skeptic because I don't even know if I exist and what's real and all of that. But that's how he gets to real certainties, that he knows I exist, God exists. Everything else can be built off of that, as those are the most foundational truths that I know. So the quick detour on Descartes, we should wrap up, I suppose. But what did you say that got me so excited about it?
It was that he's known today officially as a rationalist, right?
Right.
And a very skeptical empiricist. So I think so. What do I know? And he starts to question everything.
It's real interesting.
In his discourse on method.
What does he know rationally? He only knows one thing rationally, I think, or maybe two. Well, he knows a bunch of things rationally, perhaps. I think it depends on how you interpret it.
Yeah,
it depends on how you interpret it.
He says, "Dubito ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum." So
I doubt, therefore I think. I
I
think, therefore I
realized
am.
exactly.
Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just
Yeah,
translating for
sure.
him.
And as you say, this guy who thought so broadly and so deeply about what can we know, what do we know, including the question of God, he also, at least in his discourse on method, he muses about that quite a bit.
Yep.
And in another part, he muses about the structure of the heart, and he describes it in great detail.
And the
So
pineal gland and all this.
yeah,
Okay, so Descartes is saying, I don't know if anything is real, but I know that I'm doubting everything and I might be deceived about it all. But if I know that, then I know that I'm a deceivable creature because I've been wrong before. So therefore, I, as a thinking thing, must exist, at least whenever I try to doubt it, because I can't doubt without thinking, and I can't think without at least being a thinking thing whenever I doubt that I exist as a thinking thing. So that's the one thing I can't doubt, and I know is true. And it seems like he got there just in his brain. And then he gives an argument for God's existence. And his argument for God's existence is, I have an idea in my head, and I don't know where it came from. See, I don't really have an idea in my head of a square circle because that's not real. I have an idea in my head of a unicorn, but that's just because I have an idea of a horse and I have an idea of a horned animal like a rhinoceros. I have an idea in my head of a gold mountain, but that's because I know about gold and I know about mountains. But I have a really, really weird idea in my head that's just not like any of the other ideas. And it's not like what I know I am. I don't know where this idea came from. It's really a weird idea. I have an idea of an all knowing, all powerful, infinitely great, simple being. Simple is important, not complicated. There's no left and right to it. It's just there. It's just this one thing. There's no up or down. It's just simple. It's his love is his justice. There's only one thing to him. Where the fuck did that idea come from? Where did it come from? Because I'm not like that. I've been wrong about things, says Descartes. I'm not all knowing. So it didn't come from me. And nothing else I've ever experienced in the world is like that. Everything is limited and in a place. How is it possible that idea exists in my head? There must be such a thing. It must have left its fingerprint on me. I must have related to it. Now the question is this: how do we interpret what Descartes' done there? Is he being an empiricist or is he being a rationalist? Because it sounds like
yeah.
he's saying, I have an idea in my head and I'm coming to a conclusion. But the other half of the argument is, I must have interacted with this thing to have this idea, right?
It
My idea.
seems like he's being an empirical, rational intuitionist.
There you go. That's it. And that's why that's perfect. That'll wrap up our detour on Descartes perfectly. The reason why Descartes gives birth to the rationalist and the empiricist traditions is those are two ways of not fully understanding what the hell he was doing, right? He is crucifying between the two. That's really the insight. That's really worth noticing. And you brought it up. Those are two ways of not fully getting what he was up to. He's a consummate thinker. He's pulling these two together briefly. Okay, let's move on. That was fantastic, Roger. Nice cues. Okay, but there's also a phenomenological component. Consider again our two propositions. The first, but not the second, it has a luster. It just feels like, whoa, a truth that must be true. All unmarried men are not married. Whoa, it's glowing in my head. Like that must be true. Okay, Locke speaks in connection to clarity, Descartes, clarity and distinction. Each, I think, is referring to the same phenomenological feature. And this feature is connected with another. Upon understanding a proposition of this sort, one feels a strong inclination to accept it. This luminous obviousness seems to compel, or at least impel, assent. Aquinas and Locke, indeed, held that a person, or at any rate a normal, well-formed human being, finds it impossible to withhold assent when considering a self-evident proposition. The phenomenological component of the idea of self-evidence then seems to have a double aspect. There is the luminous aura that the sum of 2 and 1 is 3. Oh, ooh, we feel a glow around that idea. I must feel it's true. Okay, And there is also an experienced tendency to accept or to believe it. If I understand what two-ness is, and I understand what oneness is, and I understand what sums are, and you tell me 2 and 1, the sum of them is 3, I think, of course, who could doubt that, right? Well, Descartes found a way to doubt it, as we know, but it's hard to doubt something like that. Okay. Perhaps indeed the luminous aura just is the experienced impulsion towards acceptance. Perhaps these are the very same thing, two sides of the same coin. What does it feel like to encounter a self-evident proposition? It feels like, ooh, it's glowing. I must accept it. That's the same thing, perhaps. In this case, the phenomenological component would not have a double aspect I suggested that it did have. In either case, however, we must recognize the phenomenological aspect of self-evidence. Aquinas therefore holds that self-evident propositions are properly basic. So the first definition we have of what would be a properly basic belief, a self-evident one. I think he means to add the proposition evident to the senses are also properly basic. By this latter term, I think he means to refer to perceptual propositions, propositions whose truth or falsehood we can determine by looking or employing some other sense. He has in mind, I think, such propositions as, there is a tree before me. That doesn't seem so self-evident. We know Descartes. He knows how to doubt things like that. I am wearing shoes. Do I even know that I have feet, says Descartes? I'm not sure. And that tree's leaves are yellow. That one's maybe a little better. Perhaps we could rewrite these three just for fun and say, maybe that's what Aquinas meant, but post Descartes, we might say, it seems to me I am seeing a tree before me. That might not be dubitable, right? It might not be a tree, but it looks like a tree to me is less dubitable. I seem to have feet and they seem to be enclosed with shoes. Okay, right? It's harder to doubt that than it is to doubt that I actually exist as a physical being and I'm wearing shoes. Or the experience of yellowness is happening while I seem to be looking at the leaves of what seems to be a tree, something like that. Okay, but in any case, Aquinas thought even those three statements, which Descartes would have put in the category that he brought up before of clear and distinct, right? If I believe myself to be awake and I'm clearly and distinctly perceiving something and it's not an illusion, I have strong reason to think it's true, but it's still dubitable until I know that I exist and God exists, according to Descartes, which we'll spend a lot of time in year 2 going through those arguments. Okay, so he says, so Aquinas, again, this isn't Plantinga yet. This is just him talking about Aquinas. Aquinas holds that a proposition is properly basic if and only if it is either self-evident or evident to the senses. Other foundationalists have insisted that propositions basic to a rational noetic structure must be certain in some important sense. So a lot of foundationalists say that's not good enough. Self-evident isn't good enough for us to not have to argue about whether or not it's true. We need it also to be certain in some important sense. Okay, good. Thus, it is plausible to see Descartes as holding that the foundations of a rational noetic structure include not such propositions as 18 minus 20, or no, 18 through 20, those last three we just looked at, but more cautious claims about one's own mental life, for example. Okay, he's going to do what I just did. I'm sorry. It seems to me that there's a tree, is proposition 21. I seem to see something green, or as Professor Chisholm puts it, I am appeared greenly too. I am appeared greenly too. That's a wonderful.
This is a really interesting way to put it, to kind of use hedging devices that are justifiable in language by making statements about what we perceive of the world. And I don't know if you know about Stranger in the Strange Land by Robert Heinlein. He invented the witnesses, which are a very special job there. And right. There is a scene in which one of the witnesses, he asks, "What color is that house?" And the witness says,
"Blue on this side, right?"
Blue on this side.
It's not. They make no assumptions. What was the name of that book again?
Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein.
Stranger in a Strange Land. Anybody who's listening, that I can't wait to read that. I've been wanting to.
That's
I've heard that story. Blue on this side.
Robert Heinlein is an author that is known for sci-fi, but he literally draws from the ancient worlds, especially ancient Greece, Socrates, Plato, etc. And you find Plato in his Starship Troopers. You find Aristotle and others in his Stranger in a Strange Land. and also, of course, revelation and prophecy and prophets and whatnot. So he's a really interesting guy that mixes a lot of wisdom. So yeah.
Groovy. Thanks for that. Hang out with me after class in the after conversation, Roger. We've got some literature professors coming in to teach different types of literature. I want to talk to you about sci-fi and ask some questions. Okay. Thanks. Okay, now that we're post Descartes, we go, well, I think there's a tree in front of me. It seems like there is, but I don't really know. But is it possible for me to doubt the proposition? In the dream I'm in right now, I seem to be perceiving a tree. Like I'm having the yellowness experience when I'm looking at the leaves, even if there are no leaves, even if it's all a dream. So they're moving to that position here. Propositions of the latter seem to enjoy kind of immunity from error, not enjoyed by the former, right? I could be wrong about the tree. Someone could have put a big cardboard cutout of a tree and painted it really well. And I think I'm looking at a tree, but I'm not. I could be dreaming. There could be no tree. I could be a brain in a vat, and the entire physical world could be a manifestation of stupid ones and zeros fed into my brain. There's all sorts of ways of doubting that I'm looking at a tree. But can I doubt that in my brain I'm having the experience of treeness perception? It's harder to doubt. It's maybe dubitable, but it's harder to doubt. Okay. This is so much fun. I could be mistaken in thinking that I see a pink rat. Perhaps I'm hallucinating or the victim of an illusion. But it is at least very much harder to see that I could be mistaken in believing that I seem to see a pink rat, in believing that I am appeared pinkly or pink ratly too. Suppose, I love that language, appeared. I am appeared pinkly. That means I'm seeing pink. Okay, fine. Suppose we say that a proposition with respect to, or that I seem to be perceiving. Suppose we say that a proposition with respect to which I enjoy this sort of immunity from error is incorrigible for me. Then perhaps Descartes means to hold that a proposition is properly basic for S only if it is either self-evident or incorrigible for S. I can't not think it, and it can't be wrong, and it's self-evidently true and certainly true. Okay, maybe that's what we mean by properly basic, he's saying. So proposition 24. By way of explicit definition, P is incorrigible for S if and only if A, it is not possible that S believe P and P be false, and B, it is not possible that S believe not P and P be true. So it is not possible for S to believe P and P be false. I believe I am happy. I must be. I can't believe I'm happy without being happy. That's just the definition. I believe I'm sitting here talking into a microphone. It's not necessarily true that I am sitting here talking into a microphone, but it is definitely true that I believe it. If I believe it, it has to be true that I believe it. Okay. And it is not possible for me to not believe it if it is true. So I can't not believe that I'm sitting here talking into a microphone because that is what I believe. Because it is true that I believe it, not true that it's happening. So, okay, that would be an incorrigible belief. And he's looking for definitions of critiques through time of what would be properly basic. Here we have a further characteristic of foundationalism, the claim that not just any proposition is properly basic. Ancient and medieval foundationalists tended to hold that a proposition is properly basic for a person only if it is either self-evident or evident to the senses. Modern foundationalists, Descartes, Locke, Leibniz, and the like, tend to hold that a proposition is properly basic for S only if either self-evident or incorrigible for S. Of course, this is a historical generalization and is thus perilous, but perhaps it is worth the risk. And now let us say that a classical foundationalist is anyone who is either an ancient or medieval or a modern foundationalist. He's just defining terms still. We don't yet know what Plantinga thinks, but we know that he's setting the stage to argue that belief in God is properly basic. And we have spent so many videos on this already that we're going to just keep reading. So, sorry.
He's doing a thing that's really, really interesting that Aristotle also abundantly did. So he's going through the views regarding the subject of the most well-regarded thinkers that he has access to, basically. So he can
There's a reason
kind of he's taking stock of what's going on,
Absolutely.
in you know, in the scene, in the field, in the battlefield.
Okay. And he did not, so he did a look. We're going to follow him slowly. We spend a lot of time with him in year 3. Plantinga there's a reason we spend time with him. Let's get to section D of part 2, the collapse of foundationalism. Okay, so these aren't his beliefs. He's, like you said, he's following a history here to try to set things up for us to argue that belief in God is properly basic. Okay, the collapse of foundationalism. Now, suppose we return to the main question. Why should not belief in God be among the foundations of my noetic structure? The answer, on the part of the classical foundationalist, was that even if this belief is true, it does not have the characteristics a proposition must have to deserve a place in the foundations, right? We said there are characteristics. Has to be self-evident, has to be incorrigible, whatever. He says, well, people who would argue that the belief in God is not one of those would say it doesn't have those qualities. There is no room in the foundations for a proposition that can be rationally accepted only on the basis of other propositions. The only properly basic propositions are those that are self-evident or incorrigible or evident to the senses. Since the proposition that God exists is none of the above, it is not properly basic for anyone. That is, no well-formed, rational, noetic structure contains this proposition in its foundations. But now, let's take a closer look. We must take a closer look at this fundamental principle of classical foundationalism. Right? Plantinga hasn't said I am a classical foundationalist. He says I got to these ideas through my examination of what classical foundationalism did. So let's look at this fundamental principle. He says a proposition P is properly basic. It would be so good if I had written this up so we could put it right on the video comments. Proposition P is properly basic for person S if and only if P is either self-evident to S or incorrigible for S or evident to the senses for S. Now, if we post that, we should be able to show it there. Okay, cool.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
I'll try to do that next time.
Some of these are, have a bit to parse.
All
yeah,
right.
so he's going through self-evident, which means intuitionism, I think.
Contains 2 claims. First, a proposition is properly basic if it is self-evident, incorrigible, or evident to the senses. And second, a proposition is properly basic only if it meets this condition. The first seems true enough. Suppose we concede it. But what's to be said of the second? Is there any reason to accept it? Why does the foundationalist accept it? Why does he think that the theist ought to? So he's saying, why are those the only things that are allowed to be considered self-evident or foundational? We should note that first, that in this thesis and the correlative foundationalist thesis, that a proposition is rationally acceptable only if it follows from or is probable with respect to what is properly basic. If these claims are true, then enormous quantities of what we all in fact believe are irrational. Excuse me, I got lost. We should note first that if this thesis and the correlative foundationalist thesis that a proposition is rationally acceptable only if it follows from or is probable with respect to what is properly basic, if these claims are true, then enormous quantities of what we all in fact believe are irrational. Let's try that without. My brain isn't working. Let's try that without the parentheticals. We should note first that if this thesis, if these claims are true, then enormous quantities of what we all in fact believe are irrational. I don't see what that sentence is saying. I'm so sorry. I'm a little lost. One crucial lesson to be learned from the development of modern philosophy, Descartes through Hume, roughly, is just this. Relative to propositions that are self-evident and incorrigible, most of the beliefs that form the stock in trade of ordinary everyday life are not probable. At any rate, there is no reason to think they are probable. Consider all those propositions that entail, say, that the enduring physical objects, or that there are persons distinct from myself, or that the world has existed for more than 5 minutes. None of these propositions, I think, is more probable than not with respect to what is self-evident or incorrigible for me. At any rate, no one has given good reason to think of any of them is. And now suppose we add to the foundations propositions that are evident to the senses, thereby moving from modern to ancient and medieval foundationalism. Then propositions entailing the existence of material objects will of course be probable with respect to the foundations because included therein. But the same cannot be said either for propositions about the past or of propositions entailing the existence of persons distinct from myself. As before, these will not be probable with respect to what is properly basic. So there are things that we don't argue to, and so they either have to be properly basic or we need to fall into a skeptical pit and keep doubting them. Does not this show that the thesis in question is false? The contention is that A is properly basic for me only if A is self-evident or incorrigible or evident to the senses. Okay, a little misspelling there. But many propositions that do not meet these conditions are properly basic for me. I believe, for example, that I had lunch this noon. Do I have to argue that I had lunch this noon? I believe I did. I could have been created 5 minutes ago with all my memories in place, and there could have been no this afternoon to have lunch in. But I believe that I had lunch this afternoon. Okay, so that seems to be a properly basic thing. I can't really argue to it. I just start with it. I do not believe this proposition on the basis of other propositions. I take it as basic. It is the foundations of my noetic structure. Furthermore, I am entirely rational in so taking it, even though this proposition is neither self-evident nor evident to the senses nor incorrigible for me. Of course, this may not convince the foundationalist. He may think that I am, in fact, do not take the proposition as basic, or perhaps he will bite the bullet and maintain that I really do take it as basic, then the fact that I am so far forth irrational. So there are two responses, he says. A foundationalist could say, you shouldn't take that as basic. You should start with proposition 1, matter exists. Proposition 2, time is longer than 5 minutes in the past. Like, let me argue to these things and then build up a case that I had lunch this afternoon. Or he might say, yeah, of course, it's proper and rational for you to believe you had lunch this afternoon. You don't need to argue to it. But then he's saying, but that doesn't meet the definition of what else you said was properly basic, meaning, namely that it was either evident to my senses, incorrigible, or self-evidently true. This statement is none of those three things, and yet I think it's properly basic. And does not this show that the thesis in question is false? The contention is that A is properly basic for me only if A is self-evident or incorrigible or evident to me with the senses. Many do not meet that proposition. Where do we leave off? What happened?
Maybe Zara, the fact one argument for God, that God had kindness enough toward us that he didn't create an epistemological horror house of a universe for us. He created a universe in which, to a great extent, we can actually get away with literally not questioning and investigating even the slightest thing, like, did we have lunch today?
Is this the same God who created hell? Maybe we're already in it. Right? If it's the same God, I mean, if we're going to be philosophers, maybe we're just in God's hell already, and we are in a world like that because we've got to think our ways out or whatever. But like,
yeah, but as a person who studied a bit of people like the Stoics, it could be way, way, way worse.
Right. Okay. Agreed. Many propositions that do not meet that are properly basic for me. Okay, perhaps the following will be more convincing. According to the classical foundationalists, call him F. A person S is rational in accepting number 26, that A is properly basic for me if it is self-evident, incorrigible, or evident to me through the senses, only if either 26 is properly basic, self-evident or incorrigible, or evident to the senses for him, or he believes it on the basis of propositions that are properly basic for him and support it. So that's true for a foundationalist of any statement. So if a foundationalist believes, this is fun, if a foundationalist believes that the only things which are properly basic are those which are evident through the senses, incorrigible, or self-evident, he has to believe that because either that statement is evident through the senses, incorrigible, or self-evident, or because he argues to it from propositions which are properly basic. Okay, what's he going to do now? Now, presumably, if F knows of some support for 26 from propositions that are self-evident or evident to the senses or incorrigible, he will be able to provide a good argument, deductive, inductive, probabilistic, or whatever, whose premises are self-evident or evident to the senses or incorrigible to those conclusions in 26. So far as I know, no foundationalist has provided such an argument. It therefore appears that the foundationalist does not know of any support for 26 from propositions that are, on his account, properly basic. So, if he is to be rational in accepting this proposition, he must, of his own account, accept it as basic. But according to 26 itself, 26 is properly basic for F if and only if it is self-evident, incorrigible, or evident to the senses for him. Clearly, 26 meets none of those conditions. Hence, it is not properly basic for him to believe it. But if he believes it, is self-referentially inconsistent in accepting 26, he accepts 26 as basic, despite the fact that 26 does not meet the conditions for proper basicality, and 26 itself lays down. Okay, that's a fun maneuver for a philosopher to make. I think we could say, if none of the foundationalists have argued that 26 is correct, maybe they just haven't gotten around to it yet, and they probably maybe could try to do that from properly basic propositions. But he's saying since they haven't done it, I just take it that they must think it's properly basic to believe it, and it doesn't match any of the definitions of the things that the statement itself says should be properly basic. So I say that is not necessary to be properly basic. You can have other properly basic things besides those which are self-evident, evident to the senses, or incorrigible. Okay. Furthermore, that statement is either false or such that in accepting it, the foundationalist is violating his epistemic responsibilities. For F, the person who is a foundationalist does not know of any argument or evidence for 26. Hence, if it is true, he will be violating the epistemic responsibility in accepting it. So the statement that it has to be one of those three things to be properly basic is either false or such that F cannot rationally accept it. Still further, if the theist were to accept 26 as the foundationalist urging, but without argument, he would be adding it to his noetic structure a proposition that is either false or such that in accepting it, he violates his noetic responsibilities. But if there is such a thing as the ethics of belief, which we will get to, it's in epistemology class, which we'll be doing later, surely it will prescribe believing a proposition one knows to be either false or such that one ought not to believe it. Accordingly, I ought not to accept this proposition in the absence of argument from premises that meet the conditions that it lays down. The same goes for the foundationalist. If he cannot find such an argument for the truth of the statement that the only properly basic statements are those which are incorrigible, self-evident, or evident to the senses, then he ought to give it up. Furthermore, he ought not to urge that I ought to accept any objection to theistic belief that crucially depends upon a proposition that is true only if I ought not to believe it. This is why Plantinga is so much fun.
He could have even gone farther. He could have used conjunction instead of disjunction and demanded for something to be considered basic to satisfy all three.
Right. Okay. It could even be worse. But this is what's so fun. He's saying you shouldn't tell me something is true for no good reason, that if it is true, I shouldn't accept it. If it is true that the only self-evidently true things are those three, this statement is not one of them, and you gave me no reason to accept it, except you just put it out there. So if it's not properly basic, I shouldn't be accepting it according to your own definition. So get out of here with your "this is what makes things properly basic" idea. Okay, nearly everyone accepts as basic some propositions entailing the existence of other persons and some propositions about the past. Not nearly everyone accepts the existence of God as basic. Struck by this fact, we might propose a new proposition. Let's write this one down. P, I can't do italics, but P is properly basic for S to believe, that's the person if and only if, that's IFF, means if and only if, he is self-evident or incorrigible or evident to the senses for S, or is accepted as basic by nearly everyone. Okay, so this is going to be Plantinga speaking and adding his own thought. What if I add a fourth category? If everybody accepts that we live in a causal nexus, well, let's borrow from Kant for a moment. All right, so if I point out two phenomena, there's a rock in my front yard that's warm, the sun is out in the sky and it's warm. I could believe that the sun has made the rock warm. I could believe that the rock has made the sun warm. I could believe that both of them are being made warm by something else. I could believe that there's no connection between each of their warmths, but I cannot believe that those two phenomena exist outside of a causal nexus. They either cause each other or they don't, but there's no way of thinking of them as outside things cause things, because that's just how brains work. They sort of put that on it. So if everybody comes to the world with those types of ideas, or we could use even more basic ones, he says, look, everybody accepts that there are other minds besides their own. We can have philosophical arguments about it. I guess not every philosopher accepts these things. We do make cases for and against. It's the problem of other minds, which we'll talk about, but we accept it in order just to function. I mean, you just can't get up in the morning and go do your daily chores if you don't think the past exists. Like, I was created a billionth of a second ago with all my memories intact. What am I doing here? There's no reason for any of this. Like, I mean, just you can't start that way. So if you kind of have to believe it in order to function, he's sort of adding, it seems to me, something like that as a fourth qualifier for something to be properly basic. There are problems with this statement that's up on the screen right now, he says. It is meant to legitimize my taking as basic such deliverances of memory as that I had lunch this noon. But not nearly everyone takes that proposition as basic. Most of you, I dare say, have not so much as given it a thought, whether or not I had lunch this afternoon. So you must be too busy thinking about your own lunch to think about mine. So 27 won't really work. All right, he's giving a first stab at it, and he says, it doesn't work, obviously. That is of no real consequence, however, for even if we had an appropriate statement of 27, it would suffer from some sort of malady, as does 26. So even if I had done a better job of it, it still wouldn't work. There's going to be a problem here. Don't you see how Plantinga just has 8 different voices in his head, arguing back and forth different things as he tries to move forward? It's really fantastic. Nor is it self-evident, incorrigible, or evident to the senses. So unless we can find an argument for it from propositions that meet the conditions it lays down, we shall, if we believe it, be believing a proposition that is probably either false or such that we ought not to believe it. So the exact same trick he just used against 26, the statement of the traditional foundationalists, he says, well, that would work against my new statement too. If I'm not going to argue for it from properly basic principles, you shouldn't believe it unless you think it's properly basic, which it doesn't fit the categories, including the fourth one of being properly basic. So if it is true, you shouldn't accept it. And okay, this doesn't work. It's obviously that was a bad first attempt, he says. So unless we, therefore, we ought not to believe it, at least until someone produces such an argument for it. Now, we could continue to canvass other revisions of 26. And in part 3, I shall look into the proper procedure for discovering and justifying such criteria for properly basics. That's what we're going to do next in part 3. We're going to try to, so he's just bringing up the topic. He's just setting the stage. He's saying, okay, now we're going to get to part 3, where I'm going to try to figure out what are the proper requirements for something to be said to be properly basic. It is evident, however, that classical foundationalism is bankrupt. And insofar as the evidentialist objection is rooted in classical foundationalism, it is poorly rooted indeed. Okay, so the objection to believing in God, which says, show me the evidence. Oh, Lord, why did you take such pains to hide yourself? We needed more evidence, Father. It's like, that doesn't work because it's based in a foundationalism, he says, and foundationalism is bankrupt. It doesn't work. Of course, the evidentialist objection need not presuppose classical foundationalism. Just because it has, okay, so I'm following him now. Okay, just because it has doesn't mean it has to. Someone who accepted quite a different version of foundationalism could no doubt urge this objection, but in order to evaluate it, we should have to see what criterion of proper basicality was being invoked. In the absence of such specification, the objection remains at best a promissory note. So far as the present discussion goes, then, the next move is up to the evidentialist objector. He must specify a criterion for proper basicality that is free from self-referential difficulties, rules out belief in God as properly basic, and is such that there is some reason to think it is true. Okay, so he says the foundationalisms I've examined don't work, but there could be one that does work one day. But it's on you to come up with one, and your objection is rooted in that. And so we're going to need to see. We got a link here. We're going to need to see. Very cool.
This
That's
link
awesome.
here seems like pretty much all of Platinga's essays.
Yeah,
Perhaps the one you're reading is one of these.
probably. Let's put that up for people who want to go and look at Plantinga's essays. All right, fantastic. So we've made it now to the end of part 2, and we are taking a lot of videos on this one essay. But Plantinga is really great, and it's sort of fun to read this. Typically, we only take one video per essay, and we do want to move along a little bit faster here at some point. Once again, so what we're going to do, unfortunately, is we're going to just keep reading and try to make it a little bit further because we've gone so slowly here. So this is the beginning of part 3. The Reformed objection to natural theology. Okay, here we go. Suppose we think of natural theology as an attempt to prove or demonstrate the existence of God. This enterprise has a long and impressive history, a history stretching back to the dawn of Christendom and boasting among its adherents many of the truly great thinkers of the Western world. One thinks, for example, of Anselm, Aquinas, Scotus, Occam, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. Recently, since the time of Kant, perhaps the tradition of natural theology has not been as overwhelming as it once was, yet it continues to have able defenders both within and without officially Catholic philosophy. Many Christians, however, have been less than totally impressed. In particular, Reformed or Calvinist theologians have, for the most part, taken a dim view of this enterprise. A few Reformed thinkers, Warfield, for example, endorse the theistic proofs, but for the most part, the Reformed attitude has ranged from tepid endorsement through indifference to suspicion, hostility, and outright accusations of blasphemy. And this stance is initially puzzling. It looks a little like the attitude some Christians adopt towards faith healing. It can't be done, but even if it could, it shouldn't be. What exactly, or even approximately, do these sons and daughters of the Reformation have against proving the existence of God? What could they have against it? What could be less objectionable to any but the most obdurate atheist? I think he's going to agree with them, by the way. So why is it that some people don't want to prove the existence of God? Some faithful people, some religious people. Like, well, if you prove his existence, where's the room for faith anymore? And anyway, well, we'll see. The objection, so he says he studied Reformed theology and he studied foundationalism. He studied a few different things to eventually get to his conclusion that belief in God is properly basic. And so he's taking us through that journey. Part A of part 3, the objection initially stated. By way of answering.
It's because, man, it takes courage. It takes courage to be open to both possibilities. Some people, they really want God to exist because they believe in God for comfort. To counter what they perceive as existential dread and their mortality, and God and what comes with God, afterlife, etc. They really, they're really emotionally invested in that. Well, I really praise thinkers who have this courage, this intellectual honesty, and courage to really go through this. So yeah, go ahead, man.
Very good. All right. Part A, the objection initially stated. By way of answering this question, I want to consider 3 representative Reformed thinkers. Let us begin with the 19th century Dutch theologian Herman Bavinck. Quote, A distinct natural theology, obtained apart from any revelation merely through observation and study of the universe in which man lives, does not exist. Scripture urges us to behold heaven and earth, birds and ants, flowers and lilies, in order that we may see and recognize God in them. Lift up your eyes on high and see who hath created these. Isaiah 40:26. Scripture does not reason in the abstract. It does not make God and conclusions of a syllogism, leaving it to us whether to think the argument holds or not. But it speaks with authority. Both theologically and religiously, it proceeds from God as the starting point. We receive the impression that belief in the existence of God is based entirely upon these proofs. But indeed, that would be a wretched faith, quote, which before it invokes God must first prove his existence, unquote. The contrary, however, is the truth. There is not a single object the existence of which we hesitate to accept until defined proofs are furnished. Of the existence of self, of the world around us, of logic, of moral laws, etc. We are so deeply convinced because of the incredible impressions which all these things make upon our consciousness that we need no arguments or demonstrations. Spontaneously, together involuntarily, without any constraint or coercion, we accept that existence. Now, the same is true in regard to the existence of God. The so-called proofs are by no means the final grounds of our most certain conviction that God exists. This certainty is established only by faith, that is, by the spontaneous testimony which forces itself upon us from every side. Okay, that's the quote from this Dutch theologian. And he says, that's a really good example of the kind of argument I'm talking about. Reformed theology is saying, how dare you? How dare you act as though the existence of the divine, one of the fundamental parts of our environment, of our being, of consciousness, of the universe, like this is a fundamental ingredient. Like, if I talked to you and you told me I had to prove that matter exists every day before I can talk about grass or whether or not vanilla is better than chocolate ice cream, I'd be really annoyed with you, right? Like, who are you to take the existence of matter and make it something I have to prove all the time? Likewise, why would you take the idea of God, which forces itself upon our consciousness all the time, and tell us we have to argue for his existence before we can talk about his attributes or what it is he wants from us or something? Like, how dare you? So that's this reformed attitude, he says. It's a great quote to embody that. According to Bavnik, Plantinga goes on, then belief in the existence of God is not based upon proofs or arguments. By argument here, I think he means arguments in the style of natural theology, the sort given by Aquinas and Scotus, and later by Descartes, Leibniz, Clarke, and others. And what he means to say, I think, is that Christians do not need such arguments. Do not need them for what? Here, I think Bavnik means to hold two things. First, arguments or proof are not, in general, the source of the believer's confidence in God. Typically, the believer does not believe in God on the basis of arguments, nor does he believe such truths as that God has created the world on the basis of arguments. Second, argument is not needed for rational justification. The believer is entirely within his epistemic rights in believing, for example, that God has created the world, even if he has no argument at all for that conclusion. The believer does not need natural theology in order to achieve rationality or epistemic propriety in believing. His belief in God can be perfectly rational even if he knows of no cogent argument, deductive or inductive, for the existence of God. Indeed, even if there is no such argument. So he's just saying, this is what I think the guy's saying. Bavinck has three further points. First, he means to add, I think, that we cannot come to knowledge of God on the basis of argument. The arguments of natural theology just do not work. And he follows this passage with a more or less traditional attempt to refute the theistic proofs, including an endorsement of some of Kant's fashionable confusions about the ontological argument. Second, so this is great. He believes in God and wants you to stop thinking there are good arguments for his existence. Second, Scripture proceeds from God as the starting point. And so should the believer. There is nothing by way of proofs or arguments for God's existence in the Bible. That is simply presupposed. The same should be true of the Christian believer, then. He should start from belief in God rather than from the premises of some argument whose conclusion is that God exists. What is it that makes these premises a better starting point anyway? And third, Bavinck points out that belief in God relevantly resembles belief in the existence of the self and of the external world. And we might add belief in other minds in the past. In none of these areas do we typically have proof or arguments or need proof or arguments. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Now we're getting to, okay, wait a minute. I was looking at the Reformed theologians and I'm saying, I think they're onto something here, right? I think, wait, hold on. There's a whole category of things that we don't feel the need to argue for. We just take them as properly basic. Why shouldn't God be in that category? All right, suppose we turn next. All right, so let's pause here for a second and talk about that. Elena, I know it's really late where you are, and thank you for joining us. If you're still awake and you'd like to say anything about that last little burst there, it was kind of fun, and then we'll move on to John Calvin's version of the same argument. We may have lulled you to sleep.
Yeah, please drop some words, Elena, or.
Yeah, we miss you. We're so glad to be back.
Yeah, it's so good to hear your voice from time to time. Yeah, she's awake. Awesome.
Oh, is she? She's writing? All right. Yeah. Unmute yourself when you can. I'm awake. All right. Well, if you feel like talking, just say hi.
I just found it really interesting that he says that the belief in self and the world is relevant to the belief of God, which might lead to a really ridiculous situation in which a really egotistical, narcissistic person is basically projecting. So he's projecting his entire ego to his image of God into the universe. So the egoic narcissist will say, of course there's God and he's awesome. And in parentheses, because I am awesome.
Yeah, okay. I'm not exactly sure I followed you there, but I did partly. I followed you at least halfway. So let me ask you a question. So for Descartes, if he's just projecting everything, he can't project the idea of God, because the idea of God is so different from everything he knows himself to be that he shouldn't have it in his head. I don't know if that's what you're talking about.
Well, the idea of God in Descartes could have been innate. Could be. Human beings could be wired to believe in God through
innate,
evolutionary biology, whatever. It's a possibility. But from the material that I've been reading, that touches a lot about transpersonal psychology, the synergic theory of Jacobo Greenberg, Carlos Castaneda, Mexican shamanism, etc. There might be, and Jung as well, there might be this thing which is the collective consciousness, and brains are, even if ever so slightly, connected to each other, and this connection basically produces the experience of God, which is something that is fundamentally present in the essence of existence, of being.
This innate ideas are a cool idea. And we're going to go on year one. We're going to pick up in the a priori section again. So I want to say something I touched on earlier with, I had said something I didn't really back up, but should, which is, oh, okay. I see what you're saying, Elena. Yeah, cool. So these rationalists, quote unquote, Descartes and Socrates, are empiricists. We can look at Plato, at least, in his attempt to understand Socrates, and he says, everything I know comes through experience. He says, so I must, when I die, be reunited with the infinite because I've experienced him. That's the only way I can have that impression in my mind, right? And Descartes says the same thing. I know gold because I've experienced it. I know mountains because I've experienced them. I can imagine a gold mountain, even though I've never experienced it, because I've experienced both gold and mountains. But why do I have this idea of the infinite? Where did it come from? Why is it making an impression on my mind, nothing is like that. None of the things I've ever encountered are like that. They're all in specific locations with specific lengths, breadths, and widths. They come into being, they go out of being. They're all finite, they're all limited. Where did this idea come from? And it sounds like you're saying, well, one of two places. Either evolution just programmed you to have it, but there's a question still there, I think, which is if evolution is all that surrounds the living organism, shaping it to fit in well with it, there must be something infinite in your surroundings to make an impression of the infinite upon you. I mean, how else can you be shaped just accidentally? It doesn't make sense. Why would you be shaped by everything around you unless God, the divine, is one of the things around you shaping you? Because nothing else is like that, and yet you have an impression of it. These are better arguments than people think they are, right? Like, we live in a post-Cartesian scientism age where Darwinism is overrated. Darwinism is awesome, by the way. It's very sophisticated. It's very beautiful. But the Darwinists have denied the obvious truth that sexual selection and epigenetics are Palean and Lamarckian principles that need to synthesize with Darwinism. And they'll figure that out in the next couple of decades. But it's okay. They'll figure it out soon. From our philosophical and metaphilosophical perspective, and especially with the year 2 course, the backbone course that we'll be doing, I think, on Wednesdays, we're going to learn how to know what ideas are on the rise and what ideas are on the way down, because this is a cycle that keeps repeating, which allows us to make bold, arrogant statements like, I know what people will be thinking in 200 years. Nietzsche once said, the point of being a philosopher is to become timeless, to not be a product of your time, but to be outside it and be able to look at it. And that's one of the things we'll be doing on Friday as we read Zarathustra. Okay.
One important thing regarding Socrates, Plato's Socrates, basically, is okay. Yeah, there is this statement that what Socrates knows is what comes from his senses, but you also have the Meno dialogue, where he expounds on the theory of recollection. And he demonstrates how a slave boy who was never instructed in mathematics
he knows it.
Supposedly has these truths, these fundamental truths of the nature and patterns of the universe already inside him. He needed just
how does he have them?
Some instigation to unlock them. Yeah, how does he have such divine knowledge?
Because when he dies, he's reunited with the infinite, and he's experiencing all these truths. We come into birth having to remember all the things we've already known. That's what our education is, according to Plato. Is we're being reminded of the things we already know, which are sort of what we knew when we were reunited with the infinite in death, and then we get reborn again. These are not, the arguments for these ideas are much more impressive than anybody who first hears the ideas in this modern post-Cartesian world that we're living in would imagine them to be. So we'll just say that and we'll move on. Okay, so John Calvin gives another argument for the same type of thing. We're going to look at that. Suppose we turn next to John Calvin, who is as good a Calvinist as any. According to Calvin, God has implanted in us all an innate, there's Roger's word right there, an innate tendency or nisus, or disposition to believe in him. Quote, there is within the human mind, and indeed by natural instinct, an awareness of divinity. This we take to be beyond controversy. To prevent anyone from taking refuge in the pretense of ignorance, God himself has implanted in all men a certain understanding of his divine majesty. Ever renewing its memory, he repeatedly sheds fresh drops. Since, therefore, men one and all perceive that there is a God and that he is their maker, they are condemned by their own testimony because they have failed to honor him and to consecrate their lives to his will. If ignorance of God is to be looked for anywhere, surely one is most likely to find an example of it among the more backward folk and those more remote from civilization. Yet there is, as the eminent pagan says, no nation so barbarous, no people so savage, that they have not a deep-seated conviction that there is a God. So deeply does the common conception occupy the minds of all. So tenaciously does it inhere in the hearts of all. Therefore, since from the beginning of the world there has been no religion, no city, no region, no city, in short, no household that could do without religion, there lies in this a tacit confession of a sense of deity inscribed in the hearts of all. Indeed, Calvin continues, the perversity of the impious, who, though they struggle ferociously, are unable to extricate themselves from the fear of God, is abundant testimony that this conviction, namely, that there is some God, is naturally inborn in all and is fixed deep within, as it were, in the very marrow. From this, we conclude that it is not a doctrine that must first be learned in school, but one of which each of us is master from his mother's womb, and which nature itself permits no one to forget. Okay, so Plantinga is saying, here's another quote by another Reformed theologian saying exactly what I'm suspecting they may have found a grain of truth in. I think they might be right on this one, fellas. This God thing might just be properly basic, but let's see how they get there. Maybe he'll get there differently. He says Calvin's claim then is that, oh, were you about to talk?
Yeah, just saying that
Go ahead.
you did an awesome read through.
Oh, I'm glad that
The voice
It's
was
very
really
Calvinistic.
appropriate, very Calvinistic. Thank you.
Right, that's what I was thinking. Okay, so Plantinga says, thank you. Calvin's claim then is that God has created us in such a way that we have a strong tendency or inclination toward belief in him. This tendency has been in part overlaid or suppressed by sin. Were it not for the existence of sin in the world, human beings would believe in God to the same degree that, and with the same natural spontaneity, that we believe in the existence of other persons or an external world or the past. This is the natural human condition, is because our presently unnatural sinful condition that many of us find belief in God difficult or absurd, or we struggle against it, as Calvin says. The fact is, Calvin thinks one who does not believe in God is in an epistemically substandard position. Now, one of the good things about reading this essay right now is that at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, we're going to start our introduction to epistemology. And Plantinga is using a lot of epistemological terminology here, so we can start getting used to it right now. We can highlight that later today. Okay. This is the natural human condition. The fact is, Calvin thinks one who does not believe in God is in an epistemically substandard position, or rather, like a man who does not believe that his wife exists, or thinks that she is like a cleverly constructed robot that has no thoughts, feelings, or consciousness. Although this disposition to believe in God is partially suppressed, it is nonetheless universally present, and it is triggered or actuated by a widely realized condition. Quote, lest anyone then be excluded from access to happiness. He not only sowed in men's minds the seed of religion of which we have spoken, but revealed himself and daily discloses himself in the whole workmanship of the universe. As a consequence, men cannot open their eyes without being compelled to see him. Like Kant, Calvin is especially impressed in this connection by the marvelous compages of the starry heavens above. Even the common folk and the most untutored, who have been taught only by the aid of the eyes, cannot be unaware of the excellence of divine art, for it reveals itself in this innumerable and yet distinct and well-ordered variety of the heavenly host. And Calvin's claim is that one who accedes to this tendency and in these circumstances accepts the belief that God has created the world, perhaps upon beholding the starry heavens, or the splendid majesty of the mountains, or the intricate, articulate beauty of the tiny flower, is entirely within his epistemic rights in so doing. It is not that such a person is justified or right. All right, so before we read on, I want to just share a thought that I had a long time ago for what it might be worth. There's this verse in the New Testament where Paul says that all of nature attests to the existence of the divine, or something like that, so that no man is without excuse. That's sort of what we're talking about here. In the 1970s, there were a group of post-Cartesian scientismist, creationist types who believed what Descartes made the world believe, which is that scientific truth, objective truth, is the highest form of truth. And they wanted to prove that the Bible is objectively, scientifically, that kind of truth. And so they wrote a lot of books about how, like, you can look at how complicated everything is and just deduce that there must be a very intelligent creator behind it all. That's how their arguments go. I'm no expert in theology, and I'm not here to be the person who gives proper theological scriptural interpretation. But it seems to me that there's another way of reading that verse. It's possible that the world is so complicated that it's like a signpost pointing to God. But it's also possible that, like an author who writes himself into his novel, you can get to know God personally through your experience with nature, that the majesty of God is in the mountain and the beauty of God is in the sunset, and that type of idea. I have no idea, but that's probably heretical, and maybe some Catholic theologians will tell us why there's no such thing as saving grace through natural theology or whatever. But I guess we'll just get rid of that idea then. It is not that such a person is justified or rational in so believing by virtue of having an implicit argument. Some version of the teleological arguments say, no, he does not need any argument or for justification or rationality. His belief need not be based in any other propositions at all. Under these conditions, he is perfectly rational in accepting belief in God in the utter absence of any argument, deductive or inductive. Indeed, a person in these conditions, says Calvin, knows that God exists. Let's pause. So, Roger's saying, this session is not to be taken as theological advice. If you are afraid of heresy, please consult your local minister. Fantastic. I love it. Let's make that a little disclaimer. If you're afraid, go talk to your local minister. I like that. So what's interesting here is that Calvin is not saying what Henry Morris and the 1970s creationists were saying, which is that the world is so complicated, it's a premise in the argument that concludes you to God exists. Like it's a signpost saying, hey, something this complicated must have a fancy watchmaker to make this watch. Instead, what it's saying is, do you see God? He's right there. Look, just open your eyes and look. This isn't a premise to an argument. It's boom, here he is. Poof. That's what he's saying, Calvin is saying. And then he says, elsewhere, Calvin speaks of arguments from reason or rational arguments. So this is direct encounter. Now he's going to talk about, well, what would an argument from reason be that God exists? And maybe that's not a good thing. The prophets and apostles do not boast either of their keenness or of anything that obtains credit for them as they speak, nor do they dwell upon rational proofs. Rather, they bring forward God's holy name, that by it the whole world may be brought into obedience to him. Now we ought to see how apparent it is, not only plausible opinion, not only by plausible opinion, but by clear truth, that they do not call upon God's name heedlessly or falsely, if we desire to provide in the best way for our consciences, that they may not be perpetually beset by the instability of doubt or vacillation, and that they may not also boggle at the smallest quibbles. We ought to see our conviction in a higher place than human reasons, judgments, or conjectures, that is, in the secret testimony of the Spirit. Here, the subject for discussion is not belief in the existence of God, but belief that God is the author of the scriptures. I think it is clear, however, that Calvin would say the same thing about belief in God's existence. The Christian does not need natural theology, either as the source of his confidence or to justify his belief. Furthermore, the Christian ought not to believe on the basis of argument. If he does, his faith is likely to be unstable and wavering. Okay, we're going to wrap it up soon. And subject to perpetual doubt. If my belief in God is based on argument, then I am to be properly rational, epistemically responsible. I shall have to keep checking the philosophical journals to see whether, say, Anthony Flew has finally come up with a good objection to my favorite argument. This could be bothersome and time-consuming. And what do I do if someone does find a flaw in my argument? Stop going to church? From Calvin's point of view, believing in the existence of God on the basis of rational argument is like believing in the existence of your spouse on the basis of an analogical argument for other minds, whimsical at best and unlikely to delight the person concerned. Okay, that ends section A of part 3 of this essay. So we've got a good starting point of where he's going here. We've got 2 more sections. We're not going to read them today to finish part 3, and then there's part 4 after that. The Barthian dilemma and rejecting classical foundationalism. So he's still just taking us on this journey. And if you watch the last 3 videos, we know what this journey is. He's going to eventually get us to where he has his insight that the belief in God is properly basic, but he gets it from like 3 streams, he says, and one of them is analyzing Reformed theology. And so that's what he's bringing up here. He's saying, well, I've noticed that these guys seem to think that how silly would it be to argue for God's existence? How silly would it be to need an argument for that? That's not how this works. I'm in relationship with God. I'm ongoing. I have to believe in him to do things. I don't start like I start with God. So he might have problems with how Reformed theology does that, but he's going to give us his position by the end of this. And we'll get there. So we'll get there before too long. I think next class we'll probably finish this essay. And it's crazy that we're using 4 videos for one essay when normally we use only 1 video per essay. But Plantinga is worth paying attention to and spending some time with. Like I said, we're going to spend a lot of time with him in year 3. So this has been really fun. Why don't we have 10 minutes and then we'll go to an after discussion. Roger, do you have anything to add?
Well, not much. I'm still processing all this. This very high intensity from Calvin. Well, regarding the existence of God, I didn't really find God in my personal experience by going to church. I was actually kind of disappointed. I didn't really find honest practice of religion and people having philosophically enriching ways of explaining their experience of God.
I've never heard of such a thing. What are you talking about?
I was born into Roman Catholicism, and well, I didn't have access to really very educated people like Sunday school people, etc. They were kind of small town people, and I was kind of
good for them
devouring Britannica for kids in English. When I arrived at Portugal in the 90s, people were still catching up, I think, to the rest of the Western world. The country is still reeling from the revolution 20 years prior, more or less, leaving dictatorship, basically, which was a quite cozy with Catholicism dictatorship, and they enhanced literacy here in Portugal, but not to the point of people having philosophical literacy. Only literate enough to gobble up state propaganda. That was the thing.
Okay, sure.
But I arrive with kind of half the primary school education from South Africa, so an Anglo-speaking cultural, very developed nation, and I arrive in Portugal, kind of like a Catholic backwater at the time, and I wasn't very impressed, and so I just ditched anything related to theology for like 20 years because I got very, very engaged with this scientism thing.
Sure. Yeah, it's distracting nowadays. Sure.
Yeah, but I had my
it's on the way down.
But I had my feel of that. It has its purposes, it has its uses.
Certainly.
But eventually I turned to philosophy, and I think that I am approaching this idea or this experience or this ideal of God, or actually the reality of God, without having any certainties here. It was way more productive through philosophy, Plato, the rest of the Hellenistics, the Hindu tradition, the Chinese, Tao Te Ching, for instance, the concept of Tianming from Confucius, the stuff that the Persians have been writing about, the Rumi and the others of the Sufi tradition. So these guys are way more impressive than my small town
Plantic is
Catholic.
very
Yeah,
platonic, which is one of
yeah.
the reasons we're going to look at him in year 3. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. Okay, let's talk more about that in the after show. Real quickly before we wrap it up in the last 5 minutes here. This is the new schedule that we're doing. This is class 8 of the philosophy of religion. So if you want the intro and the other essays that we've read and discussed up to this point, there's 7 other videos on the YouTube channel that lead up to where we're picking up now today. Epistemology, ethics, metaphysics, those are all going to be new classes. So at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we're going to do the first class for epistemology tonight. Wrestling with Jordan Peterson as one of the children of Nietzsche in the year 3 curriculum. And we're going to redo Decoding Zarathustra from the start again. We've done it twice now on Twitter Spaces, but we're going to do it in a recorded version. This is a fantastic course, by the way. This is the backbone of year 3. It's really so everything in year 1 is basically 85% of an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and we do it by reading little essays and discussing different subjects and getting a layout of the battlefield and that type of thing. But years 2 and 3 are very different. They're more like master's and PhD levels, and we are going to be understanding Nietzsche's Zarathustra, one of the most purposefully difficult to understand philosophical texts in the history of philosophy, better than pretty much anybody on earth. I mean, we're going to be in the top 5% of people that understand that book by the time we're done, and it gets better every time. It's really fantastic. We've been doing a really deep dive. So the year 3 complementary courses that go along with the backbone course are called deep dives in year 3, where we look at every single bit of writing and every bit of recorded video of the individuals that we look at under the rubric of people that Nietzsche made possible. Children of Nietzsche, twins of Nietzsche. We're going to do Kierkegaard. We're going to do Plantinga and Bonjour. We're going to do Jung. We're doing Jordan Peterson. So we'll be continuing the Jordan Peterson one. We'll be doing ethics and metaphysics and epistemology, the first classes. We're just starting those now. Those are all year 1s that complement the year 1 backbone course, which we're doing on Thursdays. We're about halfway through with that when we left off. So we've done the existence of God. We've done determinism versus free will. We've done the mind-body problem. I think we're halfway through the a priori section. There's 8 sections. That's basically an intro to the intro. And then these are the same type of studies, but more in depth. We're going to be continuing philosophy of mind where we left off as well. And we're going to be adding a few of these other classes in, including the year 2 backbone course. We're going to be continuing the Plato dialogues like we were doing before. And we're going to be starting Zarathustra from scratch. So we're going to end the recording now. We're going to go into the after show where we talk about Persian ideas and all sorts of really fun stuff. And then we'll see you all an hour later for the epistemology course. Let's end the stream.